So this is the banker song. I am a merchant banker, I work for a merchant bank. I'm a very high-ranking banker of the highest banking rank. And if you want to borrow some dirty cash from me, don't think about tomorrow, just spend it happily. No matter that it's crazy, no matter that it's cruel, there's plenty more where this came from, because it's based on fossil fuel. You can trust me, I'm a banker, with a bank that you can trust, to ignore the moral problem, because frankly we're not fussed. And if it makes you worry, because you can smell a stink, well, you better not smell our money, because it might make you think. I bought up half New Zealand and large parts of Siberia, where the rich and privileged can go, not you, because you're inferior. I've hired a private army and stocked up on supplies, so I can watch in comfort as the rest of the planet dies. I'm not making this up, folks, that is exactly what's happening. The rich and privileged know what's coming and they're making preparations. Oh yeah. When half the world has died from heat and a half is under the sea, I'll be alright, because whatever's left is going to be for me. Thank you. Now to the I'll get back on camera. Now to the serious part. So I'm going to be talking about two things which are related. One is the growth economy, the global growth economy, which I'm sure you will know about, and the banking system, which is keeping the global south in economic slavery. And to do that, I'm going to be explaining a bit about how money works or what money is. And if you have heard this before, that's good, because you probably need to remind people. It's very difficult to retain this information. So I'll start off with the growth illusion, and then I'll talk about the debt for climate movement and how you can get involved. So, the growth illusion. There are two well-known sayings about growth. The first is attributed to American ecological philosopher Edward Abbey. Growth for the sake of growth is the ideology of the cancer cell. He said this in 1969 as a response to American real estate development in the Midwest. The second is attributed to Kenneth Boulding, an American economist and peace activist, and has also been quoted by David Attenborough. Anyone, you'll probably recognize this one, anyone who believes that exponential growth can go on forever in a finite world is either a madman or an economist. He said this in 1973 while testifying to the US Congress. Economic growth is a direct outcome of private control of the money supply. Governments are not capitalists, individuals are. And capitalism depends on constant exploitation of new resources. As George Monbiot writes in his recent book, The Invisible Doctrine, capitalism can be summed up in 3 words: boom, bust, quit. He argues that in the last 50 years, neoliberalism, that is the idea that an unregulated economy is better for everyone than a regulated economy with fair wealth distribution, has gained the ascendancy to the point that no one except fringe thinkers now question it. There is now no political party in the world that does not accept economic growth, an elected representative of a political party, who does not accept economic growth as a solution to humanity's problems. Even the UK Greens think green growth is a good idea. Now, objection to privately owned control of money supply goes at least as far back as the late 17th century with the founding of the Bank of England. It's a private company. The saying, "give me control of a country's money supply, and I care not who makes its laws, is often attributed to the first of the Rothschild bankers. Whether he did say that or not is disputed, but it is testimony to a widespread mistrust in finances. Compare the saying commonly attributed to Henry Ford, but actually made in 1836 by American financier Nicholas Biddle. If the American people only understood the rank injustice of our money and banking system, there would be a revolution before morning. More recently, Mervyn King, Governor of the Bank of England in 2013, said, "Of all the many ways of organising banking, the worst is the one we have today." So economic growth enabled by our banking system is the direct cause of our two major problems, greenhouse gas emissions and environmental destruction. The belief that poverty can be eradicated by economic growth is a myth. In the last 50 years, the rich have got richer, the poor have got poorer in real terms, while the global economy has grown exponentially. That's the first myth. The second is that we can have green growth. There is nowhere enough energy and renewables to power a continuing growth curve. Nuclear is not a viable alternative either. It's far too expensive to set up, takes far too long, and has too short an operating life, not to mention the catastrophic dangers of meltdown and nuclear waste. Our economic growth system will get rid of us if we don't get rid of it. So, what's the answer? Two things: a stable economic system and an equitable distribution of wealth, so that the poor no longer have to struggle to survive and the wealthy pay their fair share. Hang on, isn't that communism? No, it's common sense. We don't have to get rid of capitalism to save the lives of millions. We just have to have sustainable capitalism, which means a no-growth economy. Hang on, isn't a no-growth economy a contradiction in terms? No. It just means that the totality of economic activity remains stable, not that individual enterprises within the economy can't grow. As with individuals within the population, or trees and other species in a rainforest, complex systems such as a rainforest. The rainforest itself does not have to constantly increase in size in order for there to be abundant, diverse and thriving life within it. So, that deals with the subject of growth economics. Now I'm going to talk about debt. What is the debt for climate movement and why is it important? First thing to realise, is that colonialism did not end with the withdrawal of European powers from the parts of the world they had seized during 400 years of colonial expansion. Domination and exploitation of former colonies has continued uninterrupted to the present day. How? By controlling assets and resources through the issuing of enormous, unrepayable debts. The countries which were formerly colonies of the Europeans are mostly in the southern hemisphere, and they're collectively referred to as the global south. The global north is the part of the world that has enriched itself at the expense of the global south. The global north has 25% of the world's population and 80% of the world's wealth. Global south countries are victims of a massive confidence trick, which keeps them in economic slavery. Now, why is this important to the climate movement? It's obviously important, but why is it important to the climate movement? Firstly, because global south governments have to invite global north corporations to extract their fossil fuels so they can earn the money to repay some of the interest on their debt. They can't afford to leave it in the ground. Secondly, while global south countries are in economic slavery, they can't protect their own environment or join the international climate movement, which we desperately need them to do. So that explains what is meant by the phrase debt for climate. Because the global north owes a massive debt to the global south from having basically stolen the resources of countries and subjugated their people, the global north's industrial growth caused global warming, but is much less affected by it than the global south, which didn't cause it. So there's another debt the global north owes the global south. If the global north was serious about halting global warming, there is one simple thing it could do: cancel the debt, which of course will only happen over the dead bodies of the International Monetary Fund and the banks. So I'm going to look briefly at who is exactly responsible here and how the global south got itself into this predicament. Whose fault is it? But first of all, because I'm a money rebellion warrior, I'd like to do a quick dive into what money actually is and the nature of our economic system. As someone who, for 70 years of my life, had no understanding of what money is or how economies work, I found it extremely helpful to do this research because I now understand why we're in this mess. Now everything makes a lot more sense. So, what is money, actually? All money is actually debt. In its original form, 5,000 years ago in Sumeria, it was a token given in return for the provision of a good or service in lieu of payment in kind. An IOU, in fact. People worked out that they could use these tokens in lieu of payment to others, and currency was created. Over time, kings, cities, and businesses began issuing their own currencies. Then, the issuing authorities realized they could lend more money than the reserves they actually had. That's known as fractional reserve banking, but that's no longer in operation, because nowadays, banks can create as much debt as they like, trillions, without having any reserves at all. Bank lending is completely immoral. If I lend you some money, I haven't created it in order to lend it to you. I've got it in exchange for a good or service that I provided to someone else. A bank, when it lends you money, is not doing it in exchange for a good or service that you're providing. The bank has done no work for that money. It's simply creating a debt and handing it to you. Now, because money is debt, when you repay a debt, you are effectively destroying money. The lending bank can't earn its interest off you because you've destroyed the debt that enables them to do so. That's why banks quite like having debts remaining as debts. They're happy to go on rescheduling the debts indefinitely, piling up the interest obligations of their debtors. Pure evil. So let's take a look at the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and the World Trade Organization. Here's what BBC News thinks. This is what BBC News says. The International Monetary Fund, IMF, and what is now known as the World Bank were set up to manage the post-World War II global economy. They were conceived in 1944 at a conference in Bretton Woods in the US state of New Hampshire. The IMF aims to preserve economic stability and to tackle, or ideally prevent, financial crises. Over time, its focus has switched to the developing world. The World Bank's predecessor, the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, was set up to drive post-war recovery. Now, it is the world's leading development organization working for growth and poverty reduction. Close quotes. But the IMF and the World Bank are not working to reduce poverty. They are effectively keeping the underprivileged, low-income South in poverty. Whether they think they're doing that or not, that is what they are doing. It's no different from the mindset with which European countries competed with each other hundreds of years ago to colonize the rest of the world, to bring civilization and modernization to those poor, benighted people, bestowing European culture and ideas on them while effectively enslaving them and stealing their land and resources. The main role of the World Trade Organization, the WTO, apparently is to ease global trade by liberalizing it, eliminating tariffs and trade barriers, in other words. The effect on low-income nations with weak economies is that they are forced to compete in the same market with stronger, more established economies. Struggling to survive means that they can't afford the human rights and environmental protections that countries with strong economies can, let alone invest in renewables. No less an institution than Munich Re, the reinsurance giant, states that trade liberalisation is a direct cause of environmental degradation in developing countries. WTO is based in Geneva. The IMF and the World Bank are both based in Washington, DC. The World Bank's president is from the USA, the group's largest shareholder. It's easy to see that these organisations serve the interests of the USA and Europe, otherwise they would be based in countries like Afghanistan or Yemen. It is an updated version of good old racist colonialism. Change the name and do the same. The job of the International Monetary Fund is ostensibly to stabilise the global economy. As part of this job, it does provide loans to member countries, but these loans are primarily designed to stabilise international trade and not to benefit the countries concerned. World Bank assistance is typically long-term, funded by countries, mainly the world's richest that are members of the bank, through the issuing of bonds. The banks, those are just items of debt issued by banks, which you can buy. The bank's loans are not used as a type of bailout, as is the case with the IMF, but as a fund for projects that are supposed to help develop an emerging market nation and make it more productive economically. Again, this is undoubtedly what the World Bank thinks it's doing. But if you talk to people from those supposedly benefited countries, that's not their experience at all. The claims are not borne out by the evidence. Now, to address the question many people will be asking, why are low-income countries in so much debt? The simple answer is they've been conned into it. They are told that in order to reach the standards of affluence enjoyed by rich countries, they must borrow huge amounts of money which they can repay once their economies have grown, which never happens because they can't afford the interest payments, let alone repay the principal. The promised affluence doesn't materialise. So the debts should be cancelled, which won't hurt the lending banks in the slightest, because they created the debts out of thin air in the first place. Now I'm going to give you the 6 reasons why the Jubilee debt campaign says the Global South debts should be cancelled. First, many indebted Global South governments want to spend more money on poverty reduction, but they lose that money paying off their debts. Just describe that. Second, the lenders knew that they gave to dictators or oppressive regimes, and thus they are responsible for their actions, not the people living in the countries of those regimes. For example, South Africa has been paying off $22 billion, which was lent to stimulate the apartheid regime. They have yet to recover from this. Their external debt has increased to $136.6 billion, while the number of people in the housing backlog has increased to 2.1 million from 1994's 1.5 million. Talking about dictators and oppressive regimes, these are all put in place and propped up by global north institutions. The only person to refuse to toe the line was Thomas Sankara, who's the first president of Burkina Faso. He said, basically, bugger off, I don't want anything to do with you and your dirty money. He was assassinated and replaced with a compliant leader. And that's not an isolated case, let me tell you. Now, the third reason, many lenders knew that a great proportion of the money they lent would sometimes be stolen through corruption. Fourth, the developing projects that some loans were intended to support were often unwisely led and failed because of the lender's incompetence. Fifth, many of the debts were signed with unfair terms, Several of the loan takers have had to pay the debts in foreign currency such as dollars, which makes them vulnerable to world market changes. The unfair terms can make a loan extremely expensive. Many of the loan takers have already paid the sum they loaned several times, or the sum they borrowed several times, but the debt grows faster than they can repay. 6, many of the loans were contracted illegally, not following proper processes. So those are 6 reasons the Jubilee Debt Campaign gives why Global South debt should be cancelled. But there is a 7th reason for cancelling out some of the debts, is that the money loaned by banks is created out of thin air, as I said earlier. Maurice Felix Charles Allais, I'm probably pronouncing his name wrong, 1988 winner of the Nobel Prize for Economics, said, "The, quote, miracles performed by credit are fundamentally comparable to the miracle a counterfeiter could perform by lending forged banknotes in return for interest. In both cases, the stimulus to the economy would be the same, and the only difference is who benefits." I'm nearly there. Some people argue against cancelling debt on the basis that it would motivate countries to default on their debts or to deliberately borrow more than they can afford, and that it would not prevent a recurrence of the problem. Moreover, investors could stop lending to developing countries entirely, and as we've seen, that might be a problem for the IMF and the World Bank, but it would go a long way towards solving the climate crisis. Now I'll close by answering the question, what can we do? Very little, in personal terms, obviously, but that's like saying personal action can do very little about the climate crisis. It's only when we put our voices and energy together to make enough of a noise and cause enough of a ruckus that things change. History has proved this over and over again. So we can start by holding in our awareness that the core driver of the climate and ecological emergency is the global economic system. Unless the economy changes, nothing will change. If the global south countries refuse to pay their debts on the basis that the global north owes them at least as much as they owe the global north, it would have a seismic effect on the global economy, which in turn would provide the opportunity for post-growth economics to come forward as a viable alternative. Secondly, we can hold in our awareness that defaulting on their debts to the IMF and the banks would allow global south countries to take action on climate and environment and to leave their fossil fuels in the ground. Having these 2 pictures in our understanding, we can be motivated to put our voices and our energies into the campaign to swap debt for climate and cancel global south debt. I've got 2 URLs for you here if you want to make a note of it. But that's me done.